Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, it's a matter of great fortune for me to introduce Arundhati Roy and to be a part of this panel in which we will be discussing the Ministry of Utmost Happiness under the title, which is one of the floating and repeating phrases of the novel, Akh Daleela Wann. And we will soon move on to see this short 6-minute film, which is a landscape of the novel, before we go on to talk about the novel. But already Arundhati has been introduced, and yet there is something I'd like to say. You know, I'm a philosopher and nothing else. But philosophers are obsessed with those who create new things. It is the secret origin of the new which is constantly bewitching the philosophers, and it is this origin that we always seek to understand and capture through concepts. And of course, philosophers also create things, and I have some ideas about that, but on another occasion. But here, we have a writer who we could call the step leader of lightning. And that is because she's the creator of a sense, the experience of a sense that comes through to our world from the future. It is not something that is already there, it is not something given, and it is this sense that she creates. And introducing her is also interesting for a philosopher because, as many of you know, philosophers have already been introduced for time to come through this definition of that a philosopher was born, he thought, and he died. And even if that happened about 100 or 1,000 years ago, you know, these 1,000 years don't matter. But in the case of a writer, what does it mean to introduce the writer? Because the writer's relationship to time is precisely the one who marks the sense of time, in the sense of the sense that she creates. And that is what Arundhati Roy has done, not only for the subcontinent in which we live, but in a way for the world. That is something we know. And it is this sense of the markers of time that we can easily see in each of the works that she has written. Of course, we know that she began as a filmmaker, but then with The God of Small Things, and then with a series of essays and books such as The Algebra of Infinite Justice, Greater Common Good, and Capitalism, A Ghost Story, and many others which I will not take more time to name. These are, in a way, the map of the time of the subcontinent, which matters to us most urgently today. So let us go on to watch the film and then back to our conversation.
She lived in the graveyard like a tree. At dawn she saw the crows off and welcomed the bats home. At dusk she did the opposite. When people called her names, clown without a circus, queen without a palace, she let the hurt blow through her branches like a breeze and used the music of her rustling leaves as balm to ease the pain. Who says my name is Anjum? I'm not Anjum. I'm Anjuman. I'm a mehfil. I'm a gathering of everybody and nobody, of everything and nothing. Is there anyone else you'd like to invite? Everyone's invited. Kashmiri English alphabet. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jibeen. Dear Comrade Azad Bhartiya Garu, my comrade Suguna knows to send this letter to you when she hears that I am no more. As you know, we are banned underground people, and this letter from me you can call as underground of underground. Thank you, comrade, for reading this. How to tell a shattered story? By slowly becoming everybody. No, by slowly becoming everything.
Our session is about to start. I cordially invite both of our distinguished guests to start the session.
Arundhati, the first excerpt of the novel, as well as a number of the occasions, both in Delhi and in many other parts of the world, when you read from the novel, it was the first few lines of the novel. But can you read from a different part today to mark this special occasion that you are here in Kerala?
Well, yes, I will. And just before I start, I do want to say that I'm so happy to be here, this place that I think of as home. And as you know, I rarely go to literature festivals, but this is such a wonderful festival. And I was just telling Mr. Sachidanand how proud I was just to read the statement that he has written about the idea of standing up today to a dispensation such as we have never seen before in this country. And it's time for us to really get together and use everything we can against it. So thank you, Sachidanand and Sir. I hope everybody can hear. I'm going to just read for a few minutes. This is from chapter 3, and it's a chapter called The Nativity. And although it's not the beginning of the book, it's the nerve center of the book. So it starts with a quote from Pablo Neruda, which says, "In what language does rain fall over tormented cities? It was peacetime, or so they said. All morning, a hot wind had whipped through the city streets, driving sheets of grit, soda bottle caps, and beady stubs before it, smacking them into car windscreens and cyclists' eyes. When the wind died, the sun, already high in the sky, burned through the haze, and once again the heat rose and shimmered on the streets like a belly dancer. People waited for the thunder shower that always follows a dust storm, but it never came. Fire raged through a swathe of huts huddled together on the river bank, gutting more than 2,000 in an instant. Still the amalthas bloomed, a brilliant, defiant yellow. Each blazing summer, it reached up and whispered to the hot brown sky, 'Fuck you.' She appeared quite suddenly, a little after midnight. No angels sang, no wise men brought gifts, but a million stars rose in the east to herald her arrival. One moment she wasn't there, and the next, there she was on the concrete pavement in a crib of litter, silver cigarette foil, a few plastic bags, and empty packets of Uncle Chips. She lay in a pool of light under a column of swarming, neon-lit mosquitoes, naked. Her skin was blue-black, sleek as a baby seal's. She was wide awake but perfectly quiet, unusual for someone so tiny. Perhaps in those first short months of her life, she had already learned that tears, her tears at least, were futile. A thin white horse tethered to the railing, a small dog with mange, a concrete-colored garden lizard, two palm-striped squirrels who should have been asleep, and from her hidden perch, a she-spider with a swollen egg sac watched over her. Other than that, she seemed to be utterly alone. Around her, the city sprawled for miles. 1,000-year-old sorceress, dozing but not asleep even at this hour. Gray flyovers snaked out of her Medusa skull, tangling and untangling under the yellow sodium haze. Sleeping bodies of homeless people lined their high, narrow pavements, head to toe, head to toe, head to toe, looping into the distance. Old secrets were folded into the furrows of her loose parchment skin. Each wrinkle was a street, each street a carnival, each arthritic joint a crumbling amphitheater where stories of love and madness, stupidity, delight, and unspeakable cruelty had been played out for centuries. But this was to be the dawn of her resurrection. Her new masters wanted to hide her knobby varicose veins under imported fishnet stockings, cram her withered tits into saucy padded bras, and jam her aching feet into pointed high-heeled shoes. They wanted her to swing her stiff old hips and reroute the edges of her grimace upwards into a frozen, empty smile. It was the summer grandma became a whore. She was to become super capital of the world's favorite new superpower. India, India, the chant had gone up on TV shows, on music videos, in foreign newspapers and magazines, at business conferences and weapons fairs, at economic conclaves and environmental summits, at book festivals and beauty contests. India, India, India.
You know, it's the nerve center of the novel indeed, a bit like how in War and Peace, you know, the ballroom is a nerve center of that very mammoth work of art. And everything happens towards it and then away from it. All the characters convene there. And this story has many characters, but also it pays this kind of attention to the vibrant life of things, of animals. And this excerpt you read gives a glimpse of all of that. So it is the heart of the city. It's also the heart which will not be allowed to be anymore because Jantar Mantar has been shut down as the spot of protest. But we see a different kind of city here.
Well, actually this part that I just read of the appearance of a little abandoned black baby girl on a city pavement was really the way I started writing The Ministry of Utmost Happiness many, many years ago. And it takes place in the place which everybody knows, in India at least, as Jantar Mantar, where all the kind of democratic and social movements would converge, the Bhopal, Narmada, everything, you know. And in fact, it actually happened one night. I used to spend a lot of time there, and one night at about 2 in the morning, this little baby appeared, and nobody knew what to do with it. And all the wisdom of our political and social movements didn't know what to do with it, including me. And, you know, finally the police was called, and I was so affected by that. But today, as you know, that place, that living lung of democracy has been shut down in Delhi. Nobody is allowed to convene there anymore. If you want to protest, the minimum fee is 50,000 rupees, and you have to hire the Ram Leela ground. So yeah, I mean, this moment in Jantar Mantar was when I started thinking of a novel which is like a city, a novel that is as bewildering as a city, a novel which you cannot drive down the main road and think you know, in some ways, a novel in which you never walk past anyone. Everyone has a name. And how does the machinery work, you know? So for me, in a way, The God of Small Things was a book about a family with a broken heart at its center. But it was still comforting for people. It still had a roof. It still had something familiar, though broken. Whereas the ministry is about the unhomed. The ministry blows the roof off that place, and it leaves everyone having to, including the reader and the writer and the people, having to deal with a shattered heart, where eventually people bring together these shards and try to make, if only temporarily, a mended heart. But so structurally, the idea was, can you write a book in which you don't walk past people of any class or caste or religion or gender? Can you write a book where you stop and smoke a cigarette? You go down the sideways. If you get lost, you have to find yourself and return. You can't know it. You can't know it by reading it once.
And the isolation that this baby that suddenly appears stands for, and many of the characters who could be called shattered, because it is a tale about shattered things. It's a shattered story that you are telling here, and you have a method for it. At the same time, the novel tells us very clearly that this isolation itself is not real, and there is a way in which our reading habits as well as literary habits have gotten confined to looking at people in isolated ways, to looking at them through compartmentalized labels, identities, and that itself is something that the novel shatters. And somewhere recently you called the characters trans, and you even said that it's a trans novel because there's a way in which, while they are shattered, there is a way they are constantly transitioning into something else, which also includes this betrayal of home, the refusal to accept comfort and solace in the confines of society. And Anjum perhaps is the character that first gives us that sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, something in me sort of militates against domestication. And in some ways, obviously we are used to the normal domestications that we are all subject to of home and family and motherhood and all of that. But even fame is a form of domestication, So when I wrote The God of Small Things and I won the Booker Prize, and there's this constant pressure on you to keep on being the same, right, the son of the God of Small Things or the uncle of the God of Small Things, And to me, including the business around publishing, where you have to quickly write a book which can, someone can categorize, the bookseller must know which shelf to put it on. Everything works at speed, And I wanted, and even, I mean, it's not just in literature, everything, medicine, everything, there's this specialization, right? But to me, the radical understanding comes when you write about the air, when you connect caste and gender and Kashmir and militarization and economy and climate change and water, and then the radical understanding comes. So can you write a book about the air? Can you write a book that's not baby food that you can just swallow and say, oh, okay? Can I be that writer who doesn't live between bestseller lists and literary festivals, So how can you try something which is defeating these categories, And so, yes, I mean, the first person, not the first character that I thought of, as I said, it was the baby who appears, but the first person you will read about in the book is Anjum, who many people say, why did you choose to write about a hijra? I find that question offensive and, small, reductive, because, like I said, yes, she's a person where all the characters in the book have a incendiary border running through them. Hers is a border of gender, but as you read, you see that that is not her only identity. She's also a Shia Muslim born in Old Delhi. The danger to her comes from the fact that she gets caught up in the massacre in Gujarat. She gets caught up in it not because she's a hijra, but because she's a Muslim. She escapes because she's a hijra, because people think that it's bad luck to kill a hijra,
Can you read a little bit from that section?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if everyone can hear. I'm feeling like I should be giving a political speech here, but it's hard to know. But I'll try and read a bit. Okay, so I'll just tell you briefly, Anjum, she's born in the 1950s in Old Delhi. She grows up and realizes that she's a hijra, and she moves out of her parental home into a home where people of many genders live together, called the Khwabgah. And then, when she's much older, she gets caught up in the massacre in Gujarat. She's traveled to Gujarat with an old friend of her father's called Zakir Mia. And then she returns to Delhi after having been found in the camps there. She returns, but she cannot live the life she lived before. So she moves out of the Khwabga into a graveyard just outside the old city, where, of course, she starts living almost as a ghost herself in the graveyard, along with the drug addicts and along with the whole lot of hospital waste, because the graveyard is attached to a mortuary where the dead are kept, of course, you know. And, you know, so it's a very desolate place and a dangerous place. And so I'm just going to read about how she moves there, and it's just a little bit about her looking back, not looking back, but hallucinating and imagining and remembering what happened in Gujarat. In that setting, Anjum would ordinarily have been in some danger, but her desolation protected her. Unleashed at last from social protocol, it rose up around her in all its majesty, a fort with ramparts, turrets, hidden dungeons, and walls that hummed like an approaching mob. She rattled through its gilded chambers like a fugitive absconding from herself. She tried to dismiss the cortege of saffron men with saffron smiles, who pursued her with infants impaled on their saffron tridents, but they would not be dismissed. She tried to shut the door on Zakir Mia, lying neatly folded in the middle of the street, like one of his crisp cash birds. So Zakir Mia in Old Delhi used to make these little birds out of currency notes, you know, that you make into garlands for the nikah. But he followed her folded through closed doors on his flying carpet. She tried to forget the way he had looked at her just before the light went out of his eyes, but he wouldn't let her. She tried to tell him that she had fought back bravely as they hauled her off his lifeless body, but she knew very well that she hadn't. She tried to unknow what they had done to all the others, how they had folded the men and unfolded the women, how eventually they had pulled them apart limb from limb and set them on fire. But she knew very well that she knew. They who? Newton's army, deployed to deliver an equal and opposite reaction. 30,000 saffron parakeets with steel talons and bloodied beaks, all squawking together, Musalman ka ek hi stan, Kabristan ya Pakistan. Only one place for the Musalman, the graveyard or Pakistan. Anjum, failing death, had lain sprawled over Zakir Mia, counterfeit corpse of a counterfeit woman. But the parakeets, even though they were or pretended to be pure vegetarian, tested the breeze with the fastidiousness and proficiency of bloodhounds. And of course, they found her. 30,000 voices chimed together. Ai hai, Sali Randi Hijra. Sister fucking whore Hijra. Sister fucking Muslim whore Hijra. Another voice rose, high and anxious. Another bird. Nahi yaar, mat maro. Hijron ko marna apshagun hota hai. Don't kill her, brother. Killing hijras brings bad luck. Bad luck. Nothing scared those murderers more than the prospect of bad luck. After all, it was to ward off bad luck that the fingers that gripped the slashing swords and flashing daggers were studded with lucky stones embedded in thick gold rings. It was to ward off bad luck that the wrists wielding iron rods that bludgeoned people to death were festooned with red puja threads, lovingly tied by adoring mothers. Having taken all these precautions, what would be the point of willfully courting bad luck? So they stood over her and made her chant their slogans. Bharat Mata ki jai, Vande Mataram. She did, weeping, shaking, humiliated beyond her worst nightmare. Victory to Mother India, salute the mother. They left her alive, unkilled, unhurt, neither folded nor unfolded. She alone, so they might be blessed with fortune. Butcher's luck. That's all she was, and the longer she lived, the more good luck she brought them. She tried to unknow that little detail as she rattled through her private fort, but she failed. She knew very well that she knew very well that she knew very well. The chief minister with cold eyes and a vermilion forehead would go on to win the next elections. Even after the poet prime minister's government fell at the center, he won election after election in Gujarat. Some people believed he ought to be held responsible for mass murder, but his voters called him Gujarat ka Lalla, Gujarat's beloved.
What we see in this passage is the passage from the world, or what the novel often calls dunya, slowly being edged out till there's no option left for people like Anjum and other kin of hers to make a home in the graveyard. And in this, Anjum is a metonymy for a lot of people on the subcontinent and in every part of the world. And the novel itself has a few other characters who have had very similar experiences and trajectories, like Saddam Hussein, who is a Dalit who is forced to witness the death of his own father at the hands of a Hindu lynch mob. And he just remains a part of the mob in order to save his life. And it is as a rebellion that he decides to convert to Islam and takes on the name Saddam Hussein after the dictator. And then there is someone else in Kashmir called Musa. And Musa, a bit like Tilo, is also someone who has actually lost his child. So this kind of death is what all these characters are a metonymy of. But then there is one other character in the novel, and that is Tilo. And Tilo is very unusual amongst this gallery of characters because she is not a metonymy. She seems to stand for something else from the very beginning. How does one understand a character whom at one point the novel describes as a girl who didn't seem to have a past, a family, a community, a people, or even a home? And we realize as we read the novel that this is of her own choosing. She has not been edged out. She has just recused herself in a certain way, but there is more.
Yeah, well, as I said, when we talked earlier, that in some ways, all the characters have this incendiary border running through them. So Saddam Hussein is a Dalit from Haryana who actually watches this lynch mob. Again, it refers to a true incident. And so he becomes a Muslim. So he has this border of caste and religious conversion running through him. Musa has a national border running through him as a Kashmiri. There's Tilotama. She too has a parent who is likely to have been from a Dalit caste and therefore a great mystery. So, and then we have Garson Hobart, of course, we'll talk about him. But Tilotama, see, I guess Anjum and Tilotama are like, they're like the two centrifugal forces in the book. Both women, but very different kinds of women. Anjum, the generous, raucous, wide person, ravaged, defeated, but comes back, lives in a graveyard, but then opens a guest house there, the Jannat guest house, to which everyone is invited, the place of the falling people. Tilotama is steely, quiet. I suppose they both share humor, but different kinds of humor. Anjum's is raucous. Tilotama's is like a knife that slides between organs. And they are both stubborn. I mean, obviously, they're not sort of Western feminists with slogans, but they are people who sort of, they are like water on rock. They are so stubborn that they force their path, you know, by insisting on being who they are. They have very different ideas of motherhood. Anjum, who cannot be a mother, insists on being a mother and becomes a mother by sheltering children, stealing children in the world. Tilottama doesn't want to be one, you know, and doesn't trust herself to be one. So, yeah, could you read? I'll just read a little description of her.
Before you do that, there's one joke of Tilo's that I am very tempted to share, and that is, you know, she is really like a membrane on which there's a record of all the things that happen and the politics of all these things. And a small example of that is something we all experience, the barrage of promotional text messages, political text messages that we keep repeating. One of them, of course, comes a lot on Yoga Day. And she receives one that says, "Let's unite on International Yoga Day for poolside candlelight yoga and meditation for Guru Hanumant Bharadwaj." And she tapped out a reply, "Please, let's not." You know, so that kind of extremely tiny prick, which is devastating.
Yeah, Tilottama also lives on the edge of sanity, you know. So there's a danger about her, and a danger that is perceived. You know, she's not a woman that's unloved. She's a woman who's deeply loved, but she's always sort of backing off because she recognizes her own dangerousness. At one point, I remember Hobart asks her whether she's going to marry Musa, and she says, "I'm not marrying anyone," because she says she wants to be free to die irresponsibly, you know. But Naga, the character who I'll mention here, he's a very, very sort of big mainstream journalist who moves across political spectrums from the extreme left to the extreme right. A very charming, very, very charming, very brilliant guy, actually. And he marries Tilottama, but he never really manages to hold her, you know. So Naga's pursuit of Tilo had not turned out as planned. She was meant to be just another easy conquest, yet another woman who succumbed to his irreverent brilliance and edgy charm and had her heart broken. But Tilo had crept up on him and become a kind of compulsion, an addiction almost. Addiction has its own mnemonics: skin, smell, the length of the loved one's fingers. In Tilo's case, it was the slant of her eyes, the shape of her mouth, the almost invisible scar that slightly altered the symmetry of her lips and made her look defiant even when she did not mean to. The way her nostrils flared, announcing her displeasure even before her eyes did. The way she held her shoulders, the way she sat on a pot, stark naked, and smoked cigarettes. So many years of marriage, the fact that she was not young anymore and did nothing to pretend otherwise didn't change the way he felt, because it had to do with more than all that. It was the haughtiness, despite the question mark over her stock, as Naga's mother had not hesitated to put it. It had to do with the way she lived in the country of her own skin, a country that issued no visas and seemed to have no consulates. True, it had never been a particularly friendly country, even at the best of times. But its borders were sealed, and the regime of more or less complete isolationism began only after the train wreck at the Shiraz cinema. Naga married Tilo because he was never really able to reach her. And because he couldn't reach her, he couldn't let her go. Of course, that raises another question. Why did Tilo marry Naga? A generous person would say it was because she needed shelter. A less generous view would be that it was because she needed cover. Although his was only a small part in the story, in Naga's mind, before and after Shiraz sometimes took on the overtones of BC and AD.
you know, this point in the novel, and especially the idea that it could be for the purposes of a cover that she does so, of course makes us think of the novel as a thriller. And in many ways it is a thriller, the way that there's a kidnapper, there's a slow goose chase, that's the title of one of the chapters. But at the same time, there's something which somehow the novel stylistically and aesthetically manages, which is the exact opposite. The very person that we would expect to be the most secretive is the one who starts talking. And it is astonishing that this person is in fact an agent of the state, a secret agent of the state. And the novel privileges this character. His name is Garson Hobart, you mentioned him a while ago, who speaks in first person, which is something no other character does. And it's a transgression by all conventional logics of narrative and narratologist studies. So why is he singled out in this way? And also the very basic fact that I can't think of many novels, and certainly not on the subcontinent, which have a character like this, the deep state, the heart of the state, speaking out directly to us, the readers.
Well, this character that you're speaking about, his real name is Biplab Dasgupta. As you know, Biplab, of course, in Malayalam, Viplavam, it means revolution. And he's the furthest thing from revolution that you can imagine, because he keeps complaining, you know, why did my parents call me this? After all, colonialism had ended before I was born. But the reason he's called Garson Hobart is because when he and Tilotoma and Naga and all of them first meet, he's playing the part of Garson Hobart in a novel, in a play called Norman, Is That You? And she continues to call him Garson Hobart. But Garson Hobart goes on to become an employee of the Intelligence Bureau, then posted in Kashmir, now posted in Afghanistan. And in a way, he's the greatest trance of them all, because half of him is the voice, the secret voice of the Indian state, the secret voice of the secret Indian state. And the other half of him is this thwarted, drunken, babbling lover, you know? Of Thilo. And he, I mean, he has, the difference between him and the other characters is that the part of him that is the state, after all, the state is made, the secret state is made of these secret, steely people. And he has, I don't know how, what the word would be in English or even in Malayalam, but what they call tehrav in Hindi, you know, that ability to wait, that ability to put behind immediate tragedies, even if they affect him, and take a cold historical perspective, you know, to endure, to wait it out, which is the greatest strength a state has, you know, to know that there will be trouble, there will be suffering, there will be blood. All we need to do, I mean, it had to be that way, you know. And then I thought, perhaps it's all right, because in a way, this is not even a human being speaking, you know. It is something above me, something that controls me too, the deep state.
But you brought it under you by writing it.
Yeah.
But that also shows something else. You know, we could have very conventional ideas of what a character is. And in Aristotle, character is understood in terms of ethos and action. And you could, again, say this about most characters in the novel, but not about Thilo, not about Garson. And that should also remind us that this is not a novel of the dispossessed alone, or it's not a novel of the marginalized. And in fact, I wonder whether one should ever write such novels where one claims to speak for somebody else or to give a voice to the voiceless. As you've said, that there are no voiceless people, there are only people whose voices have been willfully suppressed. But in the novel, we see in this gallery that you have characters from upper class, characters who are privileged, elite, powerful.
Well, I think that, like I said earlier, you know, that to me it was important to look at the connection between all these people, you know. I wasn't just writing a sort of misery tale, you know. I want to know what is happening in Kashmir, who are the players here? How does it connect to what's happening elsewhere? What are these connections between the elite, the upper castes, the gender, the whole thing? It only makes, to me, it only makes sense if you can connect them, you know. Otherwise, you're just, you know, by isolating it into subjects, as academics or journalists could do, you know, then your bill of health becomes less perilous because, you know, when you're discussing caste, you're not discussing communalism. When you're discussing communalism, you're not discussing the shrinking of resources that could be the reason that's creating conflict. You know, you think it's between Hindu and Muslim, but it could be because our resources are shrinking so fast. You know, jobs are disappearing, water is disappearing. How do these things connect, you know? So for me, it's not okay to walk down a street and see a person and say, this is a cobbler, this is a security guard, this is X and Y. You know, each of them has a story that brings them to the city. And what is that story, you know? So, and how does that story connect to the other one?
You know, when it comes to the connections, there is a way in which we could make lateral connections and real connections where it is the power of the novelist as an observer of society. And that kind of novelist would be a social realist novel. And if you were to treat that matter of present reality or a recent past reality through techniques, for instance, of magic, in which your idiom and your aesthetic is of magic, but what you talk about is not magical at all, it's very real, then you would have a different aesthetic which is of magic realism. And we've had great writers like Günter Grass or Marquez who have practiced it. But in this novel, in fact, you inaugurate a new kind of aesthetic, and this is where, instead of a lateral connection between all sections of reality, which are in fact not separate, there is a deeper connection. And that is a connection we begin to perceive when we look at two characters, Miss Jabin the first, and then the baby who appeared suddenly at Jantar Mantar, which you began by reading out, who's called Miss Jabin the second. So Miss Jabin the first is the one who gives us the title of this evening, Akh Daleela Wann, which means tell me a story. But tell me a story, as you know, is all literature, all stories. What is distinct about this novel is that it tells a real story, like you just said, but it also tells it through a completely new poiesis. Poiesis simply means in Greek to make something, to put it together again, but in what way do you do that as a novelist? And there, Miss Jabin the first gives us a kind of aesthetic injunction. So this phrase is something she used to repeat to her father, Musa, and she used to say, Akh Daleela Wann, and I'll read out the rest in English. It's that, tell me a story, and can we cut the crap about the jungle and the witch? Can you tell me a real story? But this is the way myths themselves are, and perhaps this subcontinent is a place where myths are real. So maybe we should not use the word in an indistinct way, because here the myths like that of Ram and Ayodhya can actually kill people, and Miss Jabin is killed. So what is it about Miss Jabin, her death, and the fact that she's the one who dictates in a way what this novel must do with reality, and it does something very different?
Well, it's really interesting that quite often when people, especially in the Western world, read a book like this, quite quickly they'll say, oh, it's magic realism. And if I say, how so? They will say, look, you have people building guest houses in the graveyard. I say, shall I show you photographs? The graveyard, especially in North India, has become a ghetto. People are being pushed into living in the graveyard out of poverty, out of fear, all of that, Equally, on this end, people will say, oh, this is just real stuff that you put into a novel, which is not true either. So how do you stay close to reality and yet make, as a novelist, a difference between literariness and literalness, So sure, there are, like the part I read to you of Anjum and her hallucination, her fort of desolation. It's not the author's magic realism. It's the character's fevered imagination. So to me, when you saw in the film how you tell a shattered story by slowly becoming everyone, no, by slowly becoming everything, and that everything is not just every kind of class or caste or gender, not just creatures, but moving between life and death, moving between different languages, moving between pamphlets, poems, music, SMS messages, legal documents, and so on. So Miss Jabin, of course, is the last, should I read that part? I just read that, maybe that's the last read. Okay. So I'll just read, this is 350. This is just, this is a chapter called The Untimely Death of Miss Jabin. And here the novel transitions from the graveyard of Delhi into a graveyard in Kashmir. The untimely death of Miss Jabin I. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jabin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that, her parents, her grandparents, and the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the time. In those blood-dim years, for reasons nobody fully understood, people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, cassipirs, concertina wire, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases of cash from the agencies on both sides of the border, the valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and of course, misses. Among them, Miss Jabin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse, nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shohada, the martyr's graveyard where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said, in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shohada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground, and from the very beginning of the insurrection, had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. Everybody understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands like bird feed up in the mountains or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance.
And it is this person who gives the name to the baby that appears, who's called Miss Jabin II. Why the second? What is it that is come? I mean, a novel that ends with a birth, the novel that ends with a small child rather than with death or marriage or any of those things that give closure.
So Miss Jabin I is Musa's daughter. Musa is Tilottama's lover, or was at some point, or one of her many lovers. And when this little baby who I read about in Jantar Mantar appears, Tilottama basically steals her. She's a kidnapper. apart from being a crazy woman. And so there are many babies that are stolen and returned and so on. And Miss Jabin II is actually the child of a comrade in the forest, Comrade Revati. And she appears almost like the antithesis of the martyr, of the Messiah. She's a little black girl born of a revolutionary and grows up in a graveyard. So eventually, Divya, the graveyard in Delhi where the Jannat guest house is built is a space of revolution. Because if you look at who lives there, who dies there, and who is buried there, it is a revolution.
And Jannat guest house is built on a graveyard. But on the other hand, there is another part of India where there's a graveyard which is built on a place that used to be called Jannat, and that was Kashmir. And this kind of a play between the meaning and the reality is something that the novel does. It kind of hovers in between, and there's somebody in the novel who is like the patron saint of this in-between space, who refuses to give in, and that is Sarmad.
Yeah.
So Sarmad is described in the novel as, Anjum asks in the graveyard that Sarmad should bless the newly married couple. And Sarmad, Hazrat of utmost happiness, the saint of unconsoled and solace of the indeterminate, blasphemer among believers and believer among blasphemers, did. So what is the significance of Sarmad? And why is he the saint, the Hazrat of utmost happiness, which brings us back to the title of the novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, a very mysterious title.
Well, Sarmad Sheikh is, of course, I'll read to you who he is. The little shrine of Sarmad is right up against the Jama Masjid in Old Delhi. It's a place that I go to, I spend a lot of time in. I have always been fascinated by him. And I'll read to you who he is. When Anjum is born, her mother, Jahanara Begum, takes her baby to Sarmad Sheikh's shrine and says, teach me how to love him. So this is, of course, the last reading, and I'll just read about Sarmad, because to me, he is the revolutionary, the man who does not allow the circle to close. He is the saint against all forms of hegemony. Not all the visitors to Hazrat Sarmad Shahid's Dargah knew his story. Some knew parts of it, some none of it, and some made up their own versions. Most knew he was a Jewish Armenian merchant who had traveled to Delhi from Persia in pursuit of the love of his life. Few knew the love of his life was Abhay Chand, a young Hindu boy he had met in the Sindh. Most knew he had renounced Judaism and embraced Islam. Few knew his spiritual search eventually led him to renounce Orthodox Islam too. Most knew he had lived in the streets of Shah Jahanabad as a naked fakir before being publicly executed. Few knew the reason for his execution was not the offense caused by his public nakedness, but the offense caused by his apostasy. Aurangzeb, emperor at the time, summoned Sarmad to his court and asked him to prove he was a true Muslim by reciting the kalima, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Sarmad stood naked in the royal court in the Red Fort before a jury of qazis and maulanas. Clouds stopped drifting in the sky, birds froze in mid-flight, and the air in the fort grew thick and impenetrable as he began to recite the kalima. But no sooner had he started than he stopped. All he said was the first phase, La ilaha, there is no God. He could not go any further, he insisted, until he had completed his spiritual search and could embrace Allah with all his heart. Until then, he said, reciting the kalima would only be a mockery of prayer. Aurangzeb backed by his qazis, ordered Sarmad's execution. To suppose from this that those who went to pay their respects to Hazrat Sarmad Shahid went without knowing his story, did so in ignorance, with little regard for facts and history, that would be a mistake. Because inside the dargah, Sarmad's insubordinate spirit, intense, palpable, and truer than any accumulation of historical facts could be, appeared to those who sought his blessings. It celebrated, but never preached, the virtue of spirituality over sacrament, simplicity over opulence, and stubborn, ecstatic love, even when faced with the prospect of annihilation. Sarmad's spirit permitted those who came to him to take his story and turn it into whatever they needed it to be. When Jahan-Ara Begum became a familiar figure at the dargah, she heard and then retailed the story of how Sarmad was beheaded on the steps of the Jama Masjid before a veritable ocean of people who loved him and had gathered to bid him farewell. Of how his head continued to recite his poems of love even after it had been severed from his body, and how he picked up his speaking head as casually as a modern-day motorcyclist might pick up his helmet and walked up the steps into the Jama Masjid, and then equally casually went straight to heaven. That is why Jahan-Ara Begum said to anyone who was willing to listen, in Hazrat Sarmad's tiny dargah, clamped like a limpet to the base of the eastern steps of the Jama Masjid, the very spot where his blood spilled down and collected in a pool, the floor is red, the walls are red, the ceiling is red. More than 300 years have gone by, she said, but Hazrat Sarmad's blood cannot be washed away. Whatever color they paint his dargah, she insisted, in time it turns red on its own. So Hazrat Sarmad is the writer. Hazrat Sarmad is like us. Our heads will recite poetry even if they cut it off. Zindabad.